right, we should be up and running. I think a couple channels should be connecting now, YouTube, LinkedIn, and it's good to see everybody out there on the wide world. We'll give you guys a chance to kind of log in, and we're here with you live this week in drones, here with a special guest, Christopher Knapp. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Awesome. So it's going to be a little different today. Instead of a panel discussion, wanted to bring a fresh face and also just a new perspective to a lot of the topics that we've addressed on this podcast over the last couple of years. Right. Typically, we're focused on enabling drones. This week in drones, right? Either enabling drones for inspections or deliveries, or law enforcement, drone as first responder, or counter UAS, right? And using systems, tools, radars, Echodyne, whatever the case, for detecting, tracking, identifying, alerting if there's a drone that shouldn't be there over your data center, over your electric utility, you name it, right? So with that backdrop, and folks, tuning in from different perspectives here, Chris brings a really interesting kind of element to this overlay, that of autonomy. I won't try to speak for him exactly to explain what all he does. I'll let him share. But, he comes from a world in which he's able to use software, AI, all sorts of, things under the hood that he can explain to allow robotics to be used, right? Autonomously in more of like swarms, be able to say, hey, these 10 drones, go out and do search and rescue in this area and look for these things, go, and allow them to actually intelligently go after accomplishing the task that you just asked for, right? So you're skipping a lot. You're using the software to try to like intelligently kind of skip through some of the complexities that keep us from experiencing that in the real world. So I think most of us are used to just one-to-one. I'm going to fly my drone. I'm going to stand there in the spot where I'm flying it, make sure, have a visual observer, and go back and forth and do the search and rescue right there real time. Well, we're so far beyond that in terms of what's really capable, right? And so we can get into that, the enablement side, and then the scary thing is, okay, well, what about the counter UAS element? What about, I've got some radars, remote ID cameras up at a prison, and we've got drones coming in delivering contraband. Well, what about, using the capability of drone swarms? And I'm sure you can get into that as well. And even red teaming, that like, can we do red teams on some of these sites to see where there might be vulnerabilities and holes in our systems, right? So that's kind of a full picture of kind of the context from our perspective here at This Week in Drones, and then some of the things I want to dive in with you, Chris. And so folks out there listening, we are, if you're listening live, Richard Reynolds, shout out. Nice to see you on there. If you guys have questions for Chris or for myself related to AI, autonomy, drones, drone detection, then feel free to send them in as we're chatting here over the next hour. So with that said, Chris, I'll turn it to you. I would love to, just for folks out there, to hear a quick timeline of your kind of your background, getting into the military and getting into uncrewed systems, and then just kind of that brief timeline we talked about earlier. Give a backdrop, and then I'll toss a question and kind of start the conversation after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris Knapp, I've been, I would say, in this community right now for almost 15, 16 years. My background is 22 years in the Navy. The latter portion of my career I spent with Air Force Special Operations and Naval Special Warfare. I am a crewed aviator, if you will, by trade, originally in the E-2 Hawkeye, so Airborne Battlefield Command and Control. Took that kind of experience and did a hard right turn into manned ISR. So the same type of stuff that drones do, just sitting in the aircraft doing direct support for guys on the ground. Spent a year in Afghanistan doing that. It was extremely rewarding, gave me exposure to the tactical level of warfare, how we can actually change things, along with human machine teaming by having Reapers in the stack with me and coordinating, how we deconflict the actions that we're doing. From there, went and got a master's and Naval Postgraduate School. The important part about that is I spent a lot of time studying innovation cycles, adoption cycles, impact of regulatory constraints, My thesis was focused on mitigating threats from disruptive innovation prior to widespread adoption, which is a mouthful, basically to say that I like to look at how we field new technologies and where are the hurdles and how do we get around those? How do we cross the chasm, if you will? From there, I got some exposure to what Naval Special Warfare was doing with uncrewed systems and kind of detailed myself to Special Reconnaissance Team 1 on the West Coast. I would say it was one of the best decisions I had made in my life up to that point, because I found the Navy I thought I joined. And that's no hit on the conventional side, but the NSW guys and gals that I got to serve with are some of the most amazing people I've ever encountered in my life. Got to get qualified on hand launched up to about 135 pounds, was an aviation safety officer specifically focused on uncrewed systems. Took a team to Iraq, spent 7 months or so there. Then cross-decked over to the East Coast. I got pulled into the group level, so one echelon higher, and was focused on the director of UAS for Naval Special Warfare's Tactical Organic Program. So I oversaw the operations, training, logistics, helped out with requirements and procurement a lot more than I thought I was, and learned a lot about how we actually, field these technologies and how do we get new equipment in the hands of the end users. That springboarded to some work in requirements and procurement, and then as the director of science technology for Special Reconnaissance Group, so kind of taking it past just the platforms, but into the sensors, the autonomy, the other things that come to play and come to bear. That final tour in the Navy was with Naval X, advising Naval X through Naval Postgraduate School. So working at that intersection of academia, industry, and the government. I got some interesting experiences with a program called Defense Ventures that existed for a little while. So I got some exposure as an intern effectively to the VC private equity world. So learned, the early stages of what was happening in defense tech, and then retired. I would say that my retirement wasn't exactly standard. I moved cross country, got married, got a new job, had a baby, and bought a house all inside of a 9-month period. So not what I would advise people to do, but it worked out in the end.
So this was told me that was about five years ago. All right.
5 years ago. So from there, I got
essentially, or somewhere in there.
Say that one more time.
I said right in the middle of probably COVID or that, somewhere in there in that timeline.
Yeah. So what's interesting is my timing, first time in my life, actually worked in my favor because it was the end of COVID where remote jobs were still proliferated. People were paying really well, all that kind of stuff. So I fell into a great job at Persistent Systems, working wireless data links. Was the VP of Unmanned Systems and Munitions for them. That gave me a lot of exposure to the importance of data links, how systems can communicate with each other. So I spent 4 years there talking about the importance of the network. And now here I'm at Gambit, and the focus is on what you can do with that network once it's established. And we talk about collaborative autonomy and systems working together, behavior-based intelligence, task-oriented type of operations. It opens a wide aperture of things to do. But what's interesting about all that is, like, right now, what we're faced with is not really a technology problem. It's an adoption problem more than anything else. What are people comfortable with? What do people trust as far as these systems?
That's pretty interesting. Okay. And then I want to dive into some of these topics before I forget. Shout out to Daniel Fuller for connecting us. I've known him for a while here in the industry, good buddy of mine. And I was just curious, how you guys met or where he falls in that in the timeline, just to give him a quick shout out, and then we'll dive into some of your last comments there.
Yeah, Dan's great people. We've crossed paths a few times, but specifically now, he's assisting Gambit on the commercial side. The reality is when you do transition into the civilian sector, you got to realize what you know and what you don't know. And I've spent some time in the civilian sector, but I haven't been in here for decades, where others have, and they understand a lot more of the intricacies on things that don't relate to the warfighter and open up opportunities in commercial markets. And frankly, My biggest focus always is not focusing as the government being your only customer, because frankly, the government is a very bad customer. I'll say it that way. You need to have a commercial line of effort, and Dan's been supporting us, and I've had conversations with him outside of Gambit. Extremely knowledgeable and great dude.
That's great, man. Well, yeah, I'll just spin off that last one. I want to, man, you brought up a lot of amazing topics there that I wanted to hit. The last comment, I will agree that, you've been here at Echodyne with the radar platforms for drone detection, of course, huge in the defense world, have been for, quite a while, over, decade, like almost, a decade and a half, 2 decades now. So that commercial arm has been essential and been exploding with drones, right? Since in the last like 5 years or so that I've been on board as well. And it's become a pretty, incredibly strong part of our business. But, all of a sudden, the World Cup has needed drone detection across the board for all these 11 host cities, and like within those 11 cities, like 200 soft sites, and I'm sure you've seen the news. They're saying, 300 drones have near these sites at least have been, either confiscated or whatever the word is. They've kind of addressed over 300 of them so far as of a couple of days ago. At least that was published in the news. Anyway, so like the commercial world and drones and autonomy and defense tech and all of that is significantly coming together. And even you're looking at like FEMA. They had they gave that first round of 250 million before the World Cup, and then second round 250 million. That's going to go to all 50 states come October. It's something that we're all tracking and want to be involved in, right? So yes, that commercial element is huge. I want to hit human machine learning. I want to hit all sorts of things, and that was a cool phrase that you brought up. So like you ended your timeline before I mentioned Dan with that comment of like, it's not, technology is not actually the true bottleneck. It's more like what people are willing to adopt or ready to adopt. I was curious, just from like kind of a philosophical standpoint, or like what you're seeing there, as listeners are working on different kinds of tech, people tuning in, they may represent, different sensors, different technologies, different software platforms, or they may be end users as well, looking to adopt drone as first responder, drone in the box with radars, or counter UAS systems at their correctional facilities or whatever it is. So I'd love to dive into that topic of, what people are ready to do.
No, it's a great place to start. The reality is that how do we build trust in systems, and how do we get to the point where these things become ubiquitous and we can use them? The inherent problem is in the realm of, let's just say, defense tech. And we can expand it to commercial side, but just in defense tech, like there's a focus on tech rather than on the defense side of it. And in that sense of, in the tech world, you push stuff out into the field and you patch it later, or you update it and you fix the problem if there is one, but you do a lot of internal testing, but you really get most of your testing done once it's in the field and in the wild. That becomes a huge problem when we talk about things where safety is a huge factor and security is a big concern. People are not going to be as willing to take that risk where people's lives could be in danger. So we come back to, how do we get people to trust, and how do we build out that capability? And the reality is autonomous systems, dull, dirty, dangerous. So with that, it almost goes in that order. Like, we should be starting with dull type things and getting people used to interacting with these systems to replace tasks that are monotonous, that require maybe a specialized operator, but are very repetitive at the end of the day. Once we get people removed from that and into a higher level of managing multiple systems that are executing those tasks, they start getting used to interacting with these. And what's really funny is a perfect example of like where we currently stay, the current state of things is, I was just at the Energy Drone and Robotics Summit in Houston. And what kind of made it a little interesting for me was there was a lot of robotics there. Some humanoid robots, some quadrupeds, things of that nature, and they're all moving around. And what you find is a lot of people are taking pictures of them. The humanoid is dancing. Like, this is one of those things where there's still a novelty to a lot of these systems. And how do we move past that? And how do we start using them for appropriate things?
That's funny.
And
I
it comes,
literally got a text of a video of a dance robot from Energy Drone Robotics, from some of the folks I know that were there as well. So that happened to me this week, literally.
yep. Yeah. So like this is kind of where we are with things. So when we start talking about why there's an adoption problem, it's because of stuff like that. There's also what I refer to as like,
what do you mean? Why? Because we've kept them, we continue to kind of proliferate like silly versions of them that just keep them as a novelty. Is that what you mean? Or
well, there is that aspect of it. It's more of like if this humanoid robot is designed to do some kind of manual task, the performance of it dancing has nothing to relate to its tasking that it's supposed to be doing. It is, let me show off the novelty of it, right? Like there's an aspect of maybe showing
like they could have it at the booth with like separating colored blocks from each other or something, and that would be
doing the job that it's supposed to replace. But one of the things that I was getting at, and one of the key components of this is that what we're up against when we come to adoption is what I've referred to as like the Tesla problem. Tesla has millions and millions and millions of safe miles, but one accident is front page news and becomes all like, well, autonomous cars don't work. And that's where you have to strike that balance. So focusing on the dull tasks where it's less risk to injury, less risk to personnel is going to enable the adoption to just come a lot quicker and be built into a process. And when we look at it from a standpoint of autonomous systems, there is, let's call it, different levels of autonomy. Like automation is something that has existed for a very long time with systems, where they have a process and they have some deterministic commands that they walk through. They have a flight logic. All of this is kind of amounts to if-then statements at the end of the day. This is very rudimentary. This is very basic. This exists. I put something into an orbit with a keyboard and a mouse. It's going to stay in that orbit, and it's going to be working the ailerons and its throttle and all that stuff. I don't have to actually manually do that, but I do have to monitor what it's doing, and I have to manually move it if I want to. And there's all these other nuances. So we move from like automated to some level of autonomy. And then there's this whole aspect of platform autonomy where the system is designed to do something, a specific task. And that autonomy supports that task, whether it's obstacle avoidance, whether it's like an inspection thing. There's just tons of different things that those can do. But the problem is that that's an individual system executing an individual operational need. Okay. So from there, we move to, well, we want these systems to start collaborating with each other. And once these systems start collaborating with each other, then it moves you more from a micromanager of systems to more of a mission manager. Because with that collaboration should, and I say should, because not everybody's going this way, but should come with behavior-based intelligence. It's, I need you to complete a task, vice this, I need you to go to this field, look left, look right, do this, do that. It's, I need you to search this field. And it's already been trained to know what that means and how that works. And then the highest level in the way we kind of structure this is systems that are not only collaborative, but are also adaptive. They're able to interpret what's going on in the world and be able to change and adapt to things as the organic nature of the real world occurs.
Almost like LLMs, when you type something wrong, like, I think you meant this, and if that's what you meant, here's the answer. And sometimes they're spot on. You had a typo or whatever, and it's like, it's smart enough to be like, hey, in this context, yeah, exactly. Now, can you maybe lay out? And you went through different stages of autonomy. If I think of like the two worlds that I live in the most, which is either drones everywhere one day, like filling the sky for delivery everywhere, and I'm using systems to try to like help make sure that there's no potential crashes and all that. But like, could you maybe share the difference between like, these levels of autonomy where you'd see it going in that world, let's say like drone delivery in mass at a city or something. And then second, like we could transition in 5-6 minutes, whatever, to like what that could look like with maybe like red teaming to create autonomy amongst a bunch of drones to like go after, kind of testing a counter UAS system. Because I think I want to touch both enablement, drone delivery, and counter, and talk about like kind of apply it what you just said to that, if you could walk people through that as they're thinking.
Yeah, I love the topic of drone delivery. I mean, the end result is this, is that it started off as probably a PR stunt more than anything else, and it was a novelty in itself. It still is a novelty to a fair extent, but the reality is there's widespread applicability for this, and it just makes logical sense of ways that we can maneuver, um, address that last tactical mile, if you will. The adoption problem that's centered around that is focused on answering some key questions. What is the liability when something goes wrong? How are we monitoring where all these systems are? And this is, obviously where, Equidyne's capability comes in huge, because the reality is we're talking about Class G airspace, uncontrolled airspace that these things would be operating in. The reality when we go to the FAA, it is nearly impossible for them to blanket the entire world or entire US with the amount of radars and things you would need to control, 1,300 feet and below. So this is where it comes into, there has to be some kind of local infrastructure, and it could even be regional, where these things are being monitored and ensuring that maybe we establish, just like jet routes for manned aircraft, maybe there are delivery routes. Like, are these things actually going to be flying over people's homes? Or are they going to be flying over specific routes that have been defined to reduce the risk that's involved? You also have a key aspect of the noise abatement issue, and people don't really consider this, but once again, was just at the Energy Drone Robotics Summit, and at that event there was somebody flying something and you could hear it in the entire room, and it was just resonating, and it became very annoying. Well, if you live anywhere near one of these drone delivery launch recovery sites, all you're hearing is buzzing all day, and nobody wants that, right? So it's like, how do we address these problems? Because again, it's an adoption problem. The technology exists. There's companies like Zipline that have done amazing things on thousands or millions of deliveries and things of that nature with these systems. But how do we get that into the hands of people?
So you're saying solving noise issues, solving some of these infrastructure issues are like bottlenecks that your mind goes to right away, that, hey, if we could solve these things, it would help with adoption. If we got adoption, then we could get to, we could go into the question I was wondering about, which is like, what does autonomy look like in that world between these drones working together in these big fleets and stuff? But I almost feel like the answer to your question was like, well, we've got a couple bottlenecks in adoption that it's like we couldn't fly a swarm that's as intelligent as you're talking about. It could be, until people are okay with just like where they're flying and what routes they're using and how the noises can be addressed and all that, right? And the safety element. Yeah. But I'm just curious, I think for people tuning in, and we got Chris Schaefer and Luke Canfield also both kind of mentioning in the comments here, thanks guys for sending those in, like they're alluding to like, well, what are the real capabilities of drones versus just like the unicorn kind of bubble that could be popped by right, like maybe people's imagination. But one of my curiosities, even in bringing you on to this show and just kind of bringing your perspective, is I think, with the autonomy that you guys have developed, you've probably pushed the capability of drones, and not just a drone, but a fleet of drones, not just a fleet, but like multiple fleets that are actually interacting and working together and all this stuff. I'd love for you to just paint a picture. It's very practical. That's like, this is in the real world, what is capable with autonomy now. Like take us to the, not just the future, take us to like what is currently possible if adoption was widespread and none of those hurdles were in the way. Like what could be happening today with drones that people don't even imagine is possible regarding like the autonomy element and such.
So we'll look at it from the standpoint of the drone delivery stuff, because that I think is the one that's most ripe for disruption, and it's something, frankly, that can be addressed today 100%. What you need is to understand that the systems, as we talked about those levels of autonomy, the systems have a level of autonomy that's built in. What you need is a layer above that is ensuring that these systems are working collaboratively, so that they, one, deconflict with each other, two, they don't double up on the work, they don't go to the same location with the same package, they can enable the timing that's required for you to load the deliveries and things of that nature. So today, if you wanted to have a drone that was at a building, you loaded it up with a package, you told it it needed to be delivered to a specific address, it could launch, it could go to the hopefully established flight route that it's supposed to be flying on, and land, deposit the package, and come back. There's a lot of automation that's in there where the collaboration comes in and it's like, okay, well, I'm flying along. How there's another drone that's coming towards me. How do I move? Do I do exactly what pilots do and always bank to the right, or do I bank to the left? Like, how do we coordinate those kind of things? I think I might have had that backwards. I think pilots bank to the left. This is what happens when you're a naval flight officer and you're not a pilot. You forget those things. But the point is that that's where the autonomy starts kicking in, where these systems are like, hey, I'm coming at you. I need you to go to the left and I will go to the right. There's an aspect of a lot of things that are occurring that people are familiar with. Go with like simply a drone light show, for example. This is very structured. This is very simplistic. It's very rudimentary. It looks really cool, but it's really just waypoint navigation. These systems are not talking to each other. They're not organizing. They're being controlled at a ground control station that puts them in certain places in a three-dimensional environment, and that's how they make these amazing images. If you were to adopt something like what Gambit's doing, what would end up happening in like a drone light show is, as we always see, we see some of the platforms fall from the sky, or we see the lights don't light up and there's just these like empty spots in the image. The autonomy that's there would understand, hey, the center of the image is a lot more important to light up and be able to be visible than the outskirts. Or I've lost 20% of my platforms. How do I then adapt the image that I have to of sources? That is where the level of autonomy exists today, and that kind of stuff can very much be applied to how you do a representative red cell for testing, training, and validating counter UAS equipment.
Well, yeah, brilliant. I'd love to get into that. That was an interesting point with the light shows. It could kind of determine, yeah, like maybe you build in a 20% buffer on the edges and different patterns, and you know that way you're like, if any of these go out, just like assign those drones to those outskirt areas, and then just like turn off that extra, extra red outline or whatever that we were going to have. Now let's just like push all the blank ones to that.
Well, so this is where the different this is where the differentiator is, though, is that we trained it on a behavior. We trained it to understand, like, the drones, and the brain that's controlling them understands all of those nuances. It's not that we have to specifically tell it
so linear
what to do.
What I just told it. Okay.
Exactly, because that's the whole problem with adoption right now and scalability is, if we are going to put a drone in the hands of every soldier, or we're going to do mass drone delivery, the 1-to-1 operator to platform ratio doesn't scale. It's just numbers. It's a numbers game at the end of the day. And when we talk about like flying multiple aircraft, even when I was in uniform and I was flying the Scan Eagle or the Blackjack, like, I could fly multiple platforms at once. I click on one, I tell it what to do, then I click on the other and I tell it what to do. The problem is now I'm controlling 2 aircraft, and now my cognitive load has doubled. Well, these systems are supposed to support what I'm doing, not make me manage the systems. Another way to phrase it is, we spend a vast majority of our time training people to use robots. We should be, and we are, training robots to support people. And that's where the focus needs to turn.
Cool.
And that turns back into that conversation of like trust. How do we make people feel comfortable that when they task a robot, they get the same reaction as if they tasked a human? And there's different pathways to do that. And one of the ways that, Gambit does it, and obviously I'm there and I think it's right, but like, we are reflecting exactly what is happening in the world of humans. And what I mean by that is, you have an individual who you want to do a new task. You have to put him through some level of training. Once he comes out of that training, he's competent to maybe complete the task in some way, shape, or form, but he's not an expert. So then once he's in the field and he's doing it, you're giving him positive and negative reinforcement. When we look at the world of robotics and where things are, when we leverage things like sim to real, we bring things into a simulated environment. We then run it through hundreds, thousands, millions of iterations for it to learn a competency level. Once it's there, we bring it into the real world, and it has a competency level to complete a task, but it's not an expert. We then leverage reinforcement learning to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down as to whether it's doing well or doing not, to build it out to that expert level. So this is something that's familiar to people, and that pathway makes sense. So as long as we continue to kind of follow what people have established as norms as the process, then adoption goes with it.
That's cool. That's really interesting. I want to bring up one thing that's coming to my mind, which is using systems like radars, if we're talking airspace, if we're talking delivery, to double check, to be that foundational sensor that's validating that these systems are actually on task, and working together. Because like some of this, as you mentioned, persistent networks, some of it's about the connectivity between them being really good. And what if that gets broken? Some of it's about, the level of autonomy on there, and how linear it is versus like how flexible. And how do we know for sure that all these systems are out there doing what we told them to do, despite all the variables? And that's one. So more of a light bulb for me as I'm thinking about, the position of our, the value of the specific sensor that we bring to the table at Echodyne. But that makes sense to me that like the more advanced all this is going, and the more you're just going like hit a button, say, go do this task, all you 20 different, UAVs, and you may run into these other 20 UAVs. And when you do, collaborate. And it's like, well, I mean, there's going to have to be a high level of trust that those systems are actually doing what you're just assuming they're all doing, right? And that's that adoption piece, that trust that you have to build over time. Because if it's one-to-one, you can just glance and, yep, it's right there, I see it. Or it's two, and you launch two, and you can just tell, well, they're a mile apart. I don't have to worry about them running into each other, but I'm going to check this one, I'm going to check that one. Like you said, you doubled your workload when you launch two separately. But if I just like hit launch on both, and then I expect they're going to work together, having systems that are actually like double, triple checking that ground truth, that truthing system, the truthing radar kind of like fits really nicely in that. Like could help enable more, sort of extension. I don't want to say more risk, but it kind of reduces the risk of experimenting to say, go forth, autonomous systems and try this, but I'm going to be double checking. If I notice, if the radar notices there's a potential I'll then immediately stand down XYZ, right? So that's kind of a cool element to that. Just thoughts.
No, it's all good stuff. And one of the things to take into consideration is the differentiator between deterministic and non-deterministic, because humans are non-deterministic, which means we have an idea of what people are going to do, but they have an element of, I didn't expect them to do that. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I learned fairly quickly in uniform was that if I asked my guys to go out and complete a task, sometimes I didn't want to exactly ask them how they completed the task, but the task always got completed. So there's an aspect of, do you really need to micromanage and oversee everything? If you assign a system to go from point A to point B and it takes a right and you expect it to take a left, as long as it's in the safety boundaries and the area you've allocated for it, doesn't really matter. And referring back to the point you're making with like radars, with Echodyne and all that, one of the key components of that is pilots, like crewed pilots, aviation. There's radars all over. They're being tracked. They all have a lot of training. There isn't an expectation that they're making mistakes or anything kind of stuff, but there's that checks and balance that has to occur to ensure that, again, it's a safe and appropriate and effective operation. The aspect that people like tend to not think about is there's a whole lot of things that we can get done. But there are a whole lot of people that are trying to do illicit things, or there's a lot of people, to be frank, are just dumb and they don't realize the nuances of
careless, non-compliant.
Yeah.
Like
they live within 5 miles. So they're like, oh, I can just launch my drone in my backyard. Well, well, no, you're within 5 miles of an airport. Like you have to do reporting and all that kind of, like, there's these like nuances to a lot of this. And when we get into where Echodyne's focused, and that's the critical part, is there's stages of layered defense. The only solution to a counter UAS problem is layered defense. And the first stage is being able to identify and know what's out there, right? I always refer back to, my roots, if you will, and look at it from the F3, EAD like mentality: find, fix, exploit, assess, and disseminate. Like that aspect is extremely important when we talk about how that layered defense is going to work. And that find piece is where everything starts to enable the chain of events that happen after that.
And how accurate your finding is, how quickly you can actually identify, classify, all of that starts to matter tremendously when it's the first foundational domino that has to fall for that whole chain, reaction, right?
Exactly.
So, okay, perfect transition then to talk about how the autonomy, swarms, intelligence, all of that can be leveraged, how you've seen it leveraged for red cell, red teaming. What comes to mind is like putting up counter UAS technology at a whatever correctional facility or an airport or you name it, somewhere. Or it could be defense oriented as well. I personally focus more on the SLTT side, the critical infrastructure side. But like, how do these electric utilities or airports or ports or stadiums need to be thinking when it comes to like, do they just buy the product that's the brand they recognize, and just hope it works? For us, like, we're a very precise radar that does what we're going to say it's going to, does what we say it's going to do. But the only way you can know that is if you test in the real world and you test against competitors, and they could kind of say whatever they want. And there's all this like kind of fog around like, what does equipment actually do? And do we need the really high resolution, or can we just get away with, the cheaper option? And so I run into that in the real world, and all that preamble to say, like, walk us through a little bit, how you would, or how you have vetted counter UAS layered systems at a certain facility using this technology you're talking about, using like multiple drones, multiple robots, whatever it looks like, that are intelligent, that are learning, that are adapting. Like, what, that's way beyond just like, let's have a drone pilot there and have them launch and have them, go in and out, up and down. And we say, hey, we saw them, like what could we be doing, at these more critical sites to vet the technology?
This is a really interesting area. I would say I am extremely passionate about the whole counter UAS, and it's a very interesting field because it's not new. I mean, you can go back to more than 10 years ago at this point in time, where DJI products were had like 40 mic attached to them, and they were dropping it on U.S. soldiers and stuff like that in conflict zones. So it's not a new threat, but after a decade, we've not come very far, and a lot of that comes down to some of the approaches that people are taking to it. So the first place to start is the fact that, again, it all starts with identifying and understanding what's out there. That part's easy. There's no excuse as to why that shouldn't be proliferated across critical infrastructure areas that could be high risk, everything with the FIFA World Cup. Like, that's the easy part. That's the easiest part that just needs to be addressed first. Where things get complicated.
Get the equipment out there. Is that what you're saying? Or
yeah, I mean, it's a matter of getting the equipment out there, and not, there isn't a one size fits all for any organization or anything. A lot of it has to be balanced with, what's the cost. But there's companies out there that are doing, counter UAS identification as a service. So like there's not really a barrier for entry, but there is a lot of noise that's out there and things that work and don't work. So part of the problem with some of these organizations that have established, the service networks, is that they're really good to find like DJI, but not homegrown type things, because they are looking for certain electronic frequencies, as opposed to something like Echodyne, where it's looking at what's out there. And the important side on Echodyne, for example, and anyone who's doing like that radar or identification, is making sure that there aren't a whole lot of false alerts, because just like anywhere else, if you get a whole bunch of false alerts, you're just going to turn it off or ignore it, and it's going to miss the things that are important, right? But in order to do that, and even to take this first step, once you for example, put up your radars. How are you confirming that they are actually identifying what you need them to identify and that there aren't any gaps or any holes? What typically happens is you'll hire somebody who does, or have somebody in your organization that flies a drone, and you're going to put it up there and you're going to fly it around and you're going to say, okay, it's good, it works. But that's not inherently representative of what the actual threat is. Do I believe that domestically in the US it's possible to have like a coordinated drone swarm attack a critical infrastructure? I don't think we're there yet. I don't want to do any fear mongering and stuff like that. But there is an aspect of multiple people that are working in a coordinated fashion that may try to do something, which we saw in the news recently for the White House at the UFC event, right? So that is there. It is a threat that exists. And the other thing is that
I thought I mentioned it's all the angles that multiple drones could be flying from as well. Even if they're flying
right,
individually, it's like, are they going to fly high, low, fast, slow? Are they coming from
exactly.
the north, from the south, behind that tree line, over that ridge? Like, so, and it's impossible for a single pilot at a given site to just like launch a drone and come in and do a thorough analysis, whether it's during a shootout, with my system versus someone else's, so then they're not being pressed to see like, are they really, really accurate, or are they just like seeing the one thing that we put up, yes, no, buy the product, right? Like that would be amazing if they pushed the line further on, let's like lean into these systems, see if they actually do what they say they're going to do, because that's where we end
And
up
that's
serving the
yeah, and
customer,
that's absolutely. And that's the whole point, is how do we ensure the customer is getting exactly what we are telling them we can provide. And this is where this little niche that Gambit has carved out in that red cell capability is, instead of having a team of guys out there, flying a whole bunch of drones, because you have risk with the amount of people you have out there, you have to have them, coordinate actions. They're only going to think in the ways that relate to their background, as opposed to you have one guy out there that's flying 5, 10, 15, 20 drones, and he effectively has a dial of how complex, like, are they just drones that are flying around? Are these drones that are coming after the target? And have the drones figure out where the vulnerabilities are, have them fly around and tell them with the reinforcement learning, yes or no, you're doing well, you're doing bad. And they can identify where those gaps are. And this happens in a lot more of a effective fashion because these systems are coordinated. So you don't have to worry about them running into each other. You don't have to deconflict with them. And you can take all the resources that you would have had with individual people flying individual drones, and they can do other things that are more important than just have these drones. They can monitor the systems. They can adjust where they are in real time. Like it's a efficiency. It's a cost savings type thing. And at the end of the day, the customer gets to feel that the system has been properly tested and vetted, and it gives them an opportunity to train to it, where it doesn't become a huge, resource constraint. Again, having to put a whole bunch of people out in the field.
You could probably do that with, off the shelf drones too, right? I mean, you could just buy, 4 of these, for like drones you buy for Christmas or whatever, and throw the software on there and hit the button and go practically, right? I mean,
And that's the
massive cost to be able to deploy something like this?
no, and that's kind of the key component. I mean, I say it with an asterisk. There are companies out there that require quite expensive sensor packages to do things that, like what Gambit's doing. But generally, the idea is to be hardware agnostic and software agnostic, and be able to load the software needed onto any of the platforms that are out there. There's also an aspect of having a architecture that is modular, where maybe you don't need to load anything onto the platforms. You can just do it all at the ground control station. I mean, that's inherently a brittle architecture when you're doing like more complex things in contested or congested environments. But for something like testing, training, and validating, like you don't have to worry about that. So the barrier for integrating on them is extremely low. You build out the behavior, and again, it turns into a dial of how complex you want the behavior to be.
No kidding. That's good, man. I'm trying to like keep up with these comments too that are coming in 100%, 200%. People are agreeing with, I think some of the comments that Chris and Luke have been making, but I'm trying to pick up where they left off, but Luke said he's actually speaking on the domestic drone threat with infrastructure in a few weeks. and there is a capability versus intent reality to threats. I'm curious where he's going with that. Like, is he saying that the threat is sort of more real and more extensive than we're thinking, or is it the opposite? Is it there's actually like a limit to capability versus like what we imagine? I'm kind of curious which way he's going, but how are you reading that?
I'm reading that as the threat is real, and the threat is not exactly what you would consider, I would say, a complex threat. But when you have no method to mitigate it and no method to identify it, then you're gonna lose. Like you're gonna suffer some massive consequences. There's like nuances when you get into critical infrastructure that people don't realize, and the first one starts with the fact that these were built for speed and growth through like the industrial revolution and other things like that, right? They were not built for security. They weren't built for being hardened sites. And a lot of the equipment that runs this country is custom built, and it's like one off. And if you lose it, it takes a long time for you to replace it. And that could be detrimental. The critical infrastructure in many cases is very brittle, which means it's a very easy target to have a big impact without a whole bunch of training and money and all that other kind of stuff. Like this is the commoditization. When you talk about 3D printing, when you talk about what's freely available on the internet for you to download and just hit the button, it's not hard to build a threat. It becomes one of those more complex things, especially if you to defend against it, especially if you don't have any in-place defenses. Thinking you're going to run out the door with like a drone buster gun and it's going to work 100% of the time is not a viable solution in this day and age.
And that assumes that there's a drone out there. I mean,
exactly.
You have to have equipment to tell you that there's something there to validate that it's a threat. On some level, you also need to have the airspace. All the flight restrictions in place and things that are coming out with 2209. That's something I want to talk more about as that proposed rulemaking, becomes a final rule. Because you can't just today, take a drone gun, even if you had the authority to shoot a drone down, and that's a very limited list that's growing. As state law enforcement agencies are being trained by the FBI, right? So we're getting some mitigation authority extended down to SLTT, hopefully more, hopefully that extends, but then you still have to have like a cause, a reasonable, like legal, justification for knocking a drone down if you see it flying over your facility. And so hopefully 2209 addresses that, and we're able to start seeing flight restrictions, reasonably placed over certain critical infrastructure. And then that way, at least like the loop is tied together. They detect it. It's legally not allowed to be flying there. They can then, and maybe they have the mitigation authority, or maybe they like send the footage or whatever, the alert to their, some centralized alert center or something, response center that I could envision being, hosted by the state police or someone who has authority. Maybe then they can communicate and show real time, hey, we've got a threat. And then maybe, who knows, right? I'm kind of envisioning like at least like how we could start to see, detect and maybe mitigate by those who have authority, at some critical infrastructure sites, right? Like, I mean, we're getting there. It's just slowly starting to move that direction with all this legislation, right?
No, you're hitting all the important points, because at the end of the day, I don't know if you've talked about before, like the Aircraft Sabotage Act, 18 U.S. Code 32. Have you ever dug into that?
Laser or do anything like do anything to like take a flying, something certified as an aircraft out of the national airspace, basically, right?
Yeah. So conceptually, people want to believe that, laws keep up with technology, but that is drastically not true. So, there's this, again, 18 U.S. Code 32, Aircraft Sabotage Act. Drones are classified as aircraft. Therefore, you can't mitigate a drone regardless of really what it's doing. Now, I think that there is a common sense mentality of that. And I've talked about this before, where like, if there is a drone flying at you and it's got an explosive on it and you do mitigate it, is anyone going to, bring you to court for violating the Aircraft Sabotage Act?
You'd have to just prove that you were actually afraid for your life, and and you
right.
And again, that's why you should, best case scenario, you have the sensors in place that you could go back in court and show radar tracks, camera footage, the camera actually cued over to it. It was classified as a drone. You have the image of the drone in the camera with the payload hanging on it. It's flying towards you. Like, that would be a lot of really good evidence to present, to show that you were reasonable, in your action.
Right. And this is 100% where it relates back to that whole aspect of identification is the first step, because it opens the door. Like, there's executive orders that have been signed recently trying to open up the aperture as to who has authorities to do what. It's going to take some time to get laws changed and other things like that. But this turns into something, again, people should be familiar with, is you have a fire exit plan for your building. You have like a active shooter drill that you run. Like, this is one of those things that you just need to have a plan in place as to what you're going to do. Because just like you alluded to, who are you calling if you see a drone over your critical infrastructure? Like, what's that number? Are they the right people to call? Or you get transferred around like 3 or 4 times? Like, these are things that need to be figured out. But it starts with you knowing that there's a threat.
Right, just acknowledging it as a policy too, and like having some sort of policy. What if there's a drone that's landed right there in your parking lot and it's still operational and it could zip off again? It could hurt someone if they're near it, or it's on the roof, or it's crash landed and you find it in the woods near your property. Like, should you touch it? Who should you bring it into?
Right.
You name it, right? All that needs to be in policy. Like, well, that's going to be even more so the case for people who want to establish these UAFRs, these unmanned aerial flight restrictions with under 2209, when that becomes a rule. Because as the draft, I think, was written, I don't know how it's going to come out in the final form, but it was, I think, required 24 months of detection data at a given site. Not only that, because that's the business case. Like, hey, we've been detecting for 24 months. Here's like the kind of the data from that show proving that we may have an issue here. So FAA, please give us the ability to restrict this airspace. But not only that, but it needs to be integrated into their policies and into their entire security posture. Kind of what you just alluded to there. It's like, yeah, we do active shooter training. We also do active drone training. And we train on it. We have sensors deployed. If something is detected or visually, we see it and it's there, it's on the ground. Here's the protocol. Here's who we call, on and on and on. The FAA is requiring all of that to be like a full-fledged part of an organization's security posture, security plan, security, all that, before they will sign off on restricting the airspace. And it's because it's like, it makes sense, because they're saying, well, if we're entrusting this airspace to you to be able to, to kind of define who's allowed to fly through it or not, you need to prove to us that you can detect and identify and differentiate and know who's flying in your airspace with your technology. And we need to trust you're going to follow the policies that you've written down that we could prove, like, for what you're going to do if someone's flying in our airspace over your property. It really, it's going to be, more challenging, I think, than people want to admit, to get those flight restrictions. But in a good way, those who are going to get them are going to have like very, very solid, refined, deep documented, drone response processes, right? So anyway, it's all there. It's all part of it.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things that can't be overlooked is, the punishment that will occur. Like, if you look at, like, for example, the FAA and their like deter whole thing that they've rolled out, that gives you a quicker pathway to, if you're doing something dumb and you didn't know it, you're not going to get hammered like you would if you were doing something illicit. That's all fine and dandy, but the reality is that I'm a firm believer that there will have to be some mitigation capabilities at critical infrastructures and all that kind of stuff, because you're not going to get the people with the proper authorities out to the place quick enough to do things. Now, those mitigation have to be realistic, right? Like, we're not going to be shooting, a CRAM like in the US over like people's homes. We're also not going to be arbitrarily shooting lasers or doing directed energy like all over like that has to all be like completely vetted, and you need to know like what's beyond the target that you're looking at. But there are some things that are a lot more basic, in the sense of you've identified it, you've identified that the direction it's going, it's broached the airspace that it's not permitted to be in. You then have the authority to likely launch a larger drone that just captures it or knocks it, like even knocking it out of the sky presents some risk. But if it's one of those that has the net, and there's a couple companies out there that are doing it where it just captures in a net and then comes and lands, like the risk to people that are in the area is minimal. The damage to the drone is probably minimal. This kind of answers a lot of the questions, and it just seems like a logical adoption thing. It's kind of interesting that just hasn't been as prolific.
Well, and it's considered kinetic, so it's sort of like maybe an adoption issue or perception issue on that technology as well. Because I like that technology for all the reasons you mentioned, and it's a powerful combination to detect with a radar and then be able to tell that sort of a net capture drone in three-dimensional space exactly where this tiny little target is, 2 miles out, northeast, whatever, and to guide it instantly to that target is a challenge in itself and requires high, good quality products, right? I mean, so
Absolutely.
I can see that kind of rolling out. Do we have any final questions? These guys are active. Luke, Chris, you guys are doing great. A couple Chris's, Chris Young as well, Chris Schaefer. Luke said 4 drone threats towards critical infrastructure. Preventing the critical event requires a detection mechanism. Ultimately, a lot of the plots so far have been stopped at the planning phase by CIs and undercovers. And I think that last piece, like you said, with the UFC fight and them uncovering that is great. But man, it's just lucky. I mean, they're great. I mean, not beyond luck, they're doing a good job. They're out there watching for those patterns of behavior or searches online or whatever they're looking for. But I mean, it's just too readily available. It's too easy to accomplish with these things. And even that story in itself shows you that was on the mind of those potential perpetrators, right? Like they knew that technology was capable. And so we've got to make sure we're prepared. I don't want to be too far behind the curve, right? In the sense that, anyways, we're sitting ducks in a sense, right? Not to sell on fear either. Like I hope that there's no, bad incident or whatever. In fact, FIFA World Cup was such a great thing in the sense that it was a very positive economic driver that's caused, FEMA to push all this money, and it's been great for equipment companies and manufacturers and training and all this. So more of that, not not more of the nefarious aspect, but I just still am baffled by a lot of these critical infrastructure sectors just throwing their hands up, saying, why even detect it if we're not allowed to shoot it down or whatever. And it's feels a little bit too much of a quick of a write-off. I think that's more what my little rant is kind of needling into, right? Like we shouldn't be writing off this threat and just throwing our hands up. Whether or not you could afford a full rollout of, at 200 sites with a full layered stack, maybe not today, that's fine. But at least acknowledge the threat, have some sort of policy about it, and at least have a strategy that's going to slow roll, hitting your most critical sites first or outfitting them first. Anyways, rant, but yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I mean, it's all good stuff. What I would say is I don't think there is enough fear in this. And I think that's part of what the driver is. It turns into one of those things that I think there are plenty of people that acknowledge the threat exists. I think that there is also a perception that maybe it's too complex to solve, or that there are specific organizations that are solving this problem when in reality they've been working a long time and they haven't made it very far. I mean, I say it this way, right? Watching something like what happened in Russia with Operation Spiderweb and thinking that is not possible, what I encourage people to do is take a look at how far 3D printing firearms has come over the last, oh man, I'm dating myself, decade at this point in time. In my paper in 2013, I think, I wrote about 3D printing and how it could be proliferated, and it was already, cat was out of the bag because it existed. You can't mitigate something once it's out in the wild. And now we're dealing with the same thing with drones and the capabilities that you can get with them. You can download a YOLO model any day of the week and train it to do target recognition. That's not complicated. That's not hard. It doesn't require a lot of skill. These are things that I think generally people kind of know, but they haven't really gotten enough of a kick in the pants to actually do something about.
I will say, I don't know if you have another meeting popping up right here on the hour. If do you or not?
I mean, I got a couple extra minutes.
Okay, go. I just didn't know if you need to hang up right this second. But just to closing thoughts, future proofing, putting the technology in today that is going to be capable of detecting the 3D printed drone, the changes that are coming so rapidly is incredibly important as well. I just one point I wanted to make. So an electric utility mentioned that to our team at Energy Drone Robotics earlier this week, where they're just like, well, if we install radars, if we install whatever, like what happens in a year, 2 years, 3 years? We need these things to be good, to last for 5, 10 years, whatever it is that they're expecting from technology. And so that's something that we focus on at Echodyne, and that a lot of these companies that have that multi-use, where there are dual use, literally of defense and commercial, are really well positioned, and to continue to update algorithms and continue to bring those advancements from real world front lines, and continue to push those updates into all the sensors that are deployed in critical infrastructure, so that we are future proofing and not just building like sort of the quickest, cheapest answer for today's threat. So I'll just drop that last comment. If you want to make any final thoughts, I guess we could keep going easily, and then we'll I know we're past the hour, so.
No, I would just say that, it was great talking with you. This was a good conversation. At the end of the day, if people are interested in what is going on in Gambit, you can check us out at gambit.us. If you're interested in the red team type stuff, we've got stuff there. And we also have a memorandum of understanding and a partnership with Pendleton UAS Test Range out in Oregon, where we've already established a relationship to be able to provide that stuff. And we're adding new partners all the time. We are very much interested in this counter UAS problem set and want to help support the testing, vetting, validating, and training of counter UAS equipment.
Come on. Well, thanks, Chris. Everybody, yeah, I'm glad you shouted out about those. Look up Chris on LinkedIn as well. Please reach out to him. And thanks, man. Well, I'll let you run to your next meeting, but I appreciate you, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Have a good one.